You would think after 73 years on this earth, I would have learned to spot the warning signs. But sometimes the most dangerous betrayals come wrapped in the familiar comfort of family love, disguised so well that by the time you see them clearly, they have already carved deep wounds into your soul. I stood at Gate B17 in O'Hare International Airport that cold Thanksgiving morning, clutching a homemade pumpkin pie that had taken me 3 hours to perfect. The terminal buzzed with the excited chatter of families reuniting, children squealing with joy as grandparents swept them into warm embraces. I checked my phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. No messages. No missed calls. Just the hollow echo of silence from the son I had raised, loved, and supported for 45 years. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered with such enthusiasm that it made my heart flutter with anticipation. My son called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that familiar charm that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood. He needed me there, he said. The business partners would be joining us for dinner, and my presence, as the family matriarch, would demonstrate our strong foundations and values. I spent weeks planning what I would wear, what stories I might share, how I could help make the evening memorable for these important guests. Standing there in that airport, watching other families embrace while I remained alone, something cold and sharp began to crystallize in my chest. I pulled out my phone and opened the social media app my granddaughter had taught me to use. The first image that appeared made my breath catch in my throat. There they were, my son, his wife, and their 2 children, seated around an elegant dining table with another family I did not recognize. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, and everyone was smiling broadly at the camera. The caption read, "Getting an early start on Thanksgiving with wonderful friends. So grateful for full tables and new connections." The timestamp showed it had been posted an hour ago. I stared at that photograph until the screen blurred. There was no empty chair, no place setting waiting for me, no indication that anyone was missing from their perfect tableau. They had never intended for me to be there at all. The realization hit me with such force that I had to sit down on the nearest bench. A young mother with a crying baby glanced at me with concern, and I managed to smile and nod that I was fine. But I was not fine. I was something far beyond hurt or disappointed. I was awakening to a truth I had been avoiding for years. My phone buzzed. A text message from my son. "Running late with the dinner prep. Why don't you grab lunch at the airport and we'll see you in a few hours?" The casual tone, the easy lie, the assumption that I would simply accept whatever explanation he offered. How many times had I swallowed similar dismissals? How many years had I convinced myself that his busy life, his important work, his growing family, simply left little room for the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him every opportunity? Instead of heading to the taxi stand as I had planned, I walked to the information desk and asked about hotels near the airport. The young man behind the counter suggested a luxury property downtown with views of Lake Michigan. Something rebellious stirred in my chest as I nodded and asked him to call for a reservation. I was not going to spend this day waiting for crumbs of attention from people who had already made it clear where I ranked in their priorities. The hotel room was more beautiful than anywhere I had stayed in decades. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gray November waters of the lake, and the afternoon light painted everything in soft, golden tones. I set my pumpkin pie on the small table by the window and cut myself a generous slice. As I ate it slowly, savoring the cinnamon and nutmeg I had blended so carefully, my phone rang. It was my son, and his voice carried a note of panic I had not heard since he was a teenager who had missed curfew. He had been calling my house, he said. Where was I? The dinner was starting soon, and his business partners were asking about me. Could I please hurry over? I took a long sip of the coffee I had ordered from room service before I answered. I told him I had seen the photographs. I told him I knew there had never been room for me at his table. And I told him not to call me again until he was ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened. The silence that followed stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted into the smooth, persuasive tone he used in business meetings. It was all a misunderstanding, he insisted. His wife had gotten confused about the timing. The other family had stopped by unexpectedly. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for why I was looking at a photograph of my family celebrating without me. But I was no longer listening to his words. I was listening to the space between them, to the careful way he avoided taking any responsibility, to the subtle implication that my hurt feelings were an overreaction to a simple scheduling error. I had heard these same patterns countless times over the years, and I finally understood them for what they were. The sound of someone who had never learned to value what I brought to his life, because I had always been too available, too forgiving, too willing to accept whatever attention he was willing to spare. I hung up the phone and sat in the growing darkness of my hotel room, watching the lights come on across the city. For the first time in years, I was not cooking for anyone, not cleaning up after anyone, not arranging my schedule around someone else's needs. The silence felt foreign and a little frightening. But underneath the discomfort was something I had almost forgotten: the possibility of choice. The next morning, I did not go home immediately. Instead, I took a taxi to the bank, where I had maintained accounts for over 40 years. The manager, a kind woman who had handled my finances since my husband's death, greeted me with her usual warm smile. I asked to review all the accounts where my son was listed as a joint holder or authorized user. What I discovered in those neat columns of numbers was a pattern of withdrawals that made my stomach turn. Large sums had been moved to cover business expenses that were never repaid. Credit cards I had co-signed for had balances that rivaled my annual pension. Investment accounts I had built over decades of careful saving had been quietly drained to fund a lifestyle I had never been invited to share. The manager pulled up transaction records going back 2 years, and together we traced a systematic draining of resources that represented the security I had built for my own future. Every time I had agreed to help with a temporary cash flow problem or co-sign for a business loan, my son had seen not a generous gesture from his mother, but access to a resource he could tap whenever his own poor planning created a crisis. I spent 3 hours in that bank, transferring funds, closing joint accounts, and removing authorizations I should never have granted in the first place. The manager offered to help me set up new accounts with enhanced security features, and I accepted gratefully. As I signed the papers, I felt something shifting inside me, like a locked door finally swinging open. That afternoon, I drove to the office of the lawyer who had handled my husband's estate years earlier. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. I explained what I had discovered, and his expression grew increasingly grim as I detailed the extent of the financial manipulation. He asked me to bring in documentation of everything I had found, and we scheduled a meeting for the following week. As I left his office, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who feel most entitled to take advantage of our love. The confrontation came that evening. My son and his wife appeared at my door just as I was finishing a quiet dinner of soup and bread. Their faces were flushed with anger, and they pushed past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. The financial moves I had made that day had apparently triggered some kind of crisis in their carefully constructed house of cards. His wife spoke first, her voice sharp with accusation. How could I be so vindictive over a simple misunderstanding? Did I not realize that my actions were threatening their children's future? Did I not care about the family business that would one day provide security for all of us? But it was my son's words that cut deepest. He stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a lifetime spent caring for him, and accused me of being selfish and manipulative. He said I was using money as a weapon to punish them for a harmless mistake. He said I was acting like a bitter old woman who could not accept that his life had grown beyond his childhood home. I listened to it all in silence, and with each accusation, something hardened inside me. These were not the words of someone who felt remorse for the pain they had caused. These were the words of someone who felt entitled to my resources and angry that I had dared to protect them. When they finally stopped talking, I asked them to sit down. I pulled out the bank statements I had printed that afternoon and spread them across my coffee table. I showed them the pattern of withdrawals, the mounting credit card debts, the systematic depletion of accounts I had spent decades building. I told them about the retirement I had been planning, the small trips I had been saving for, the security I had thought I was building for my final years. I explained how their financial irresponsibility had stolen not just my money, but my peace of mind and my ability to make choices about my own future. My son's face went through a series of expressions as he stared at the evidence. Surprise, defensiveness, and finally, a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. He did not apologize. He did not express remorse for the trust he had violated. Instead, he began to explain why his needs justified his actions. The business was going through a rough period, he said. The investments would pay off eventually. Everything he had taken was really just an advance on his inheritance anyway. Did I not want him to succeed? Did I not understand that his success would ultimately benefit the whole family? His wife nodded along with every justification, adding her own commentary about how much they had been counting on my support, how difficult it would be to maintain their lifestyle without access to my resources, how my sudden change of heart was jeopardizing everything they had worked to build. As I listened to them catalog all the ways my money had become essential to their plans, I realized they had never seen me as anything more than a resource to be managed and exploited. The mother who had raised him, the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to support his education and early career, the grandmother who loved their children unconditionally. None of that mattered as much as my utility as a source of funding for their ambitions. I stood up and walked to the front door, holding it open. I told them they needed to leave. I told them I would not be providing any more financial support, and that any money they had taken from me would be treated as loans to be repaid, according to terms my lawyer would establish. My son's face flushed red with anger. He said I was being unreasonable. That family was supposed to help each other, that I was abandoning them when they needed me most. His wife added that I would regret this decision when I was old and alone and needed their help. But I was no longer afraid of being alone. I had been alone in all the ways that mattered for years, surrounded by people who saw me only for what I could provide, rather than who I was. The prospect of solitude felt less frightening than the continuation of a relationship built on exploitation and false pretenses. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and felt the weight of 30 years of accumulated resentment lifting from my shoulders. It was not that I stopped loving my son. Love does not simply disappear because someone fails to deserve it. But I finally understood the difference between loving someone and allowing them to destroy your life in the name of that love. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I had not anticipated. The silence from my son and his family was complete and apparently permanent. No calls on my birthday. No visit during the holidays. No photographs of my grandchildren or updates about their activities. I had expected the cutoff to hurt, but I had not expected the relief that came with it. For the first time in decades, I was not walking on eggshells around someone else's moods. I was not adjusting my plans to accommodate last-minute demands for money or time. I was not lying awake at night worrying about someone else's poor decisions or wondering when the next crisis would require my intervention. I began to reclaim pieces of myself that I had set aside years earlier. I joined a book club at the local library and discovered I still loved discussing literature with other thoughtful people. I started taking watercolor classes at the community center and found unexpected joy in trying to capture the way morning light fell across my garden. I reconnected with old friends who had drifted away during the years when my son's family had consumed most of my time and emotional energy. Many of them had their own stories of difficult adult children, of relationships that had become more about obligation than affection, of the challenge of maintaining boundaries with people who felt entitled to unlimited support. 6 months after that Thanksgiving Day awakening, I received an unexpected call from my granddaughter. She was in her second year of college, studying to become a nurse, and her voice was hesitant as she asked if she could come visit me. Her parents had told her I was angry with the family, she said, but she missed our conversations and wanted to understand what had happened. When she arrived at my door that Saturday morning, I saw immediately that she had inherited her grandfather's eyes and his capacity for looking directly at difficult truths. We sat in my kitchen over coffee and homemade cookies, and I told her everything. Not to turn her against her parents, but because she was old enough to understand that family relationships are complex and that love sometimes requires difficult choices. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that revealed a maturity beyond her 20 years. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told me that she had watched her parents' financial stress escalate over the past year, had seen her father become increasingly angry and desperate, had heard conversations about my money that made her uncomfortable, even as a college student who did not fully understand the family finances. She had also noticed, she said, that I had seemed tired and sad during family gatherings for as long as she could remember. She had attributed it to the normal melancholy of aging, but now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. We spent the afternoon walking through my neighborhood, and I showed her the small improvements I had been making to my house and garden. New paint in the kitchen, a reading nook by the big window in the living room, flower beds that I was planning and planting entirely, according to my own preferences for the first time in years. As we walked, she told me about her studies, her hopes for her nursing career, her relationship with a young man who treated her with respect and genuine affection. She was building a life based on her own values and goals, and I felt proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with her connection to me. Before she left that day, she asked if she could continue visiting me, not as a go-between for her parents, but because she valued our relationship and wanted it to continue. I told her yes, and I meant it. She represented the possibility that love could exist without manipulation, that family could be defined by choice and respect, rather than obligation and exploitation. The following year brought changes I could not have imagined. My son's business failed completely, and he and his wife were forced to sell their house and move to a smaller community where the cost of living was more manageable. The lifestyle they had built on borrowed money and stolen resources collapsed, but they landed safely because they were young enough and capable enough to rebuild on a more realistic foundation. I felt sorry for them, but I did not feel responsible for their difficulties. They were facing the natural consequences of their choices, and perhaps those consequences would teach them lessons that my unlimited forgiveness and support never could. I used some of the money I had recovered to travel for the first time since my husband's death. I visited places we had talked about seeing together, and I discovered that solitary travel suited me better than I had expected. I enjoyed making my own schedule, choosing my own restaurants, spending as much or as little time as I wanted in museums and gardens and small towns that caught my interest. In a small coastal village in Maine, I met a widower who was also traveling alone. We spent 3 days exploring tide pools and secondhand bookstores, and when we parted ways, we exchanged contact information with the genuine intention of staying in touch. His letters became a source of joy and anticipation, and when he invited me to visit him in Vermont the following spring, I accepted without hesitation. I was 74 years old, and I was learning that life could still hold surprises and possibilities, and the kind of companionship that enhanced rather than diminished who I was. The relationship with my son might never heal completely, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own happiness and security for the hope that it might. My granddaughter graduated from nursing school with honors and moved to a city where she could work in a pediatric hospital. She called me regularly and visited when she could, and our relationship became one of the most precious parts of my new life. She had learned to see me as a whole person rather than just a family role, and I had learned to love her without the burden of feeling responsible for her parents' mistakes. 2 years after that devastating Thanksgiving morning, I was preparing for another holiday season with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. I had been invited to join my new friend and his adult children for their family dinner, and I was looking forward to experiencing what it felt like to be welcomed into a celebration without hidden agendas or unspoken expectations. As I prepared a dessert to contribute to the meal, I thought about the pumpkin pie I had carried to the airport that morning 2 years earlier. I had made it with such hope, such eagerness to please and contribute and be valued. Now I was making a different dessert for different people, but the motivation was entirely changed. I was not trying to buy my way into anyone's affection or prove my worth through my contributions. I was simply sharing something I enjoyed making with people who appreciated both the gift and the giver. The morning before I was to leave for Vermont, my son called. It was the first time I had heard his voice in over a year, and it sounded older, more subdued than I remembered. He wanted to know if we could talk, he said. He had some things he needed to say to me, and he hoped I might be willing to listen. I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location, a small cafe near the library where I had been spending many of my mornings. When he arrived, I barely recognized him. The confident, charming man who had manipulated me for so many years had been replaced by someone who looked worn down by genuine regret and hard-won self-awareness. He apologized. Not the surface-level apology designed to restore access to my resources, but a real acknowledgement of the pain he had caused and the trust he had violated. He told me that losing everything had forced him to examine his relationship with money, with success, and with the people who loved him. He said he finally understood that he had been treating me as a means to an end, rather than as a person deserving of respect and consideration. I listened carefully, watching his face for signs of the manipulation that had characterized our interactions for so many years. But what I saw instead was genuine remorse and a humility that was entirely new in our relationship. He was not asking for anything. He was not making promises about future behavior or requesting another chance to prove himself. He was simply acknowledging the harm he had done and expressing sorrow for it. When he finished talking, I thanked him for the apology. I told him it meant more to me than he might realize, and that I was glad he had learned from the consequences of his choices. But I also told him that an apology, no matter how sincere, could not undo years of damage or instantly restore a relationship that had been built on false foundations. If he truly wanted to rebuild our connection, it would have to be slowly, with consistent actions over time, and within boundaries that protected both of us from falling back into the old patterns. I was willing to begin that process, but only if he understood that I would never again make myself vulnerable to the kind of exploitation I had endured. He nodded and said he understood. He asked if we could have coffee again in a few weeks, just to talk, with no agenda other than beginning to know each other as the people we had become rather than the roles we had played in our damaged family dynamic. I said yes, and I meant it. Not because I was ready to trust him completely, but because I had learned that forgiveness did not require forgetting, and that love did not require the abandonment of self-protection. I could choose to give him the opportunity to earn back a place in my life without giving up the autonomy and peace I had worked so hard to build. That evening, As I packed for my trip to Vermont, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had stood alone in that airport 2 years earlier, clutching a pumpkin pie and a shattered heart, had been someone who measured her worth by her usefulness to others. She had been afraid of disappointing people, afraid of being alone, afraid of being seen as selfish or unreasonable. The woman packing for a holiday celebration with people who valued her company had learned that self-respect was not selfish, that boundaries were not punishment, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. She had discovered that loneliness was temporary, but the erosion of self-worth could last a lifetime if you did not fight to protect it. I had lost a son, at least temporarily, but I had found myself. I had given up the illusion of a close family, but I had gained the reality of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I had stopped being the person everyone could count on to absorb their poor choices and consequences, but I had become someone I could count on to make decisions that honored my own needs and values. The drive to Vermont was beautiful, through mountains touched with early snow and small towns decorated for the holidays. My friend was waiting for me with a warm welcome and a house filled with the comfortable noise of a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I spent 3 days experiencing what it felt like to be included in celebrations where everyone contributed something valuable and no one was taken for granted. On the last morning of my visit, I sat by a window overlooking a snow-covered meadow and wrote in the journal I had been keeping since that transformative Thanksgiving. I wrote about the peace that came from living according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. I wrote about the surprising strength I had discovered in myself when I finally stopped trying to be indispensable to people who had never learned to value what I offered. Most importantly, I wrote about hope. Not the false hope that had kept me trapped in destructive patterns for so many years, but the real hope that comes from understanding that it is never too late to choose a different path, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to build a life that reflects who you really are, rather than who others need you to be. I was 76 years old, and I was just beginning to understand what it meant to live for myself. The realization was both humbling and liberating, a reminder that growth and change are possible at any age if you are brave enough to face difficult truths and strong enough to act on them. As I prepared to return home to my quiet house and my carefully tended garden, I knew that I would never again mistake being needed for being loved, or confuse loyalty with the abandonment of self-respect. I had learned to value my own peace of mind above other people's approval, and that knowledge had set me free in ways I was still discovering. The story was far from over. There would be more conversations with my son, more opportunities to decide how much trust to rebuild and how many chances to offer. There would be continued growth in my relationship with my granddaughter, and perhaps deepening friendship with the kind man who had shown me that companionship could exist without exploitation. But whatever came next, I would face it as someone who had learned to love herself enough to protect her own well-being, someone who understood that the most important relationship you can cultivate is the one you have with your own conscience and your own sense of worth. That knowledge had been bought with years of pain and disappointment, but it was the foundation on which I was building the rest of my life. And for the first time in decades, the future felt full of possibility, rather than obligation, hope, rather than fear, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from finally learning to put your own needs on equal footing with everyone else's. It had taken me 76 years to discover this truth, but I was grateful to have found it at all. Some people never do.